Hello and welcome to the Dungeon Masters Guild House. This is a weekly podcast where I, your host, Matthew Whitby, sit down with amazing creators of the DMsGuild. And I am privileged, as always, to be joined by the amazing Noah Grand. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, everyone.
Like I said, I think this chat has been in the works for a little while, and I'm glad we can finally nail down a date to have this chit chat.
Glad we can nail down exactly.
So let's
been a pretty good time for me.
So I think I've noticed with some of these chats as well, I do need to get better at anticipating the delay because I'm in the UK, you're over in the US. Sometimes there's,
yes.
But I'm gonna this is gonna be a smooth podcast, I swear.
It will. There's also the anticipation of just needing to, this is the first time we've talked. We're learning each other's body language, and okay, when are they going to be done talking? That it's a learning process. Yeah. It's a learning process with everybody.
Yeah, no. So I think as well. I'll put like a 10-second timer on every time I talk, and then once that time is up, you can just jump in, and then we could be back and forth for an hour.
One second. 1 second is actually a lot longer if you're sitting and pausing.
Yeah. So let's dive straight into it then. So for those who may not be aware of some of the things that you do, what sort of products? How are you involved in the DMsGuild and the D&D community?
So the main way that I'm involved in the DMsGuild so far has been as a writer. Based on when we're recording this podcast, which is on May 4th, I had 3 adventures just by happenstance all get released within 24 hours of each other. Yeah. To help be some of them to help be a part of the Play It Forward campaign. So the production date got moved up a little bit. And I've also done some work as an editor, getting into more of a project management role, but that's something where it's still very much in the works, so I can't really talk about all the details right now.
No, interesting. And so as well, I think I remember reading on you as doing my sort of reporter. I don't know if I can call myself that, but doing my due diligence and my research. I found out you were involved in a lot of the for the PAX Adventure League content. So working with Act Inc.
So yeah, so it's important to clarify that at PAX Unplugged, one of the things is that the Roll Initiative, which is run, organized, play games at both PAX Unplugged and PAX East on the East Coast, that they ran a number of Adventurous League games. And also one of the things that the Roll Initiative did for the first time in collaboration with Penny Arcade and getting a lot of people involved was producing some Acquisitions Incorporated adventures, specifically for PAX Unplugged, and that was something that people really enjoyed. All the adventures. There was a great team that the Roll Initiative put together, and I ended up playing a pretty large role in that as the writer for the large multi-table interactive event.
Wow!
Called Franchise Fracas.
Is it still called an epic, or was this before the sort of epics had a title?
So D&D Epics is trademarked by Adventurous League.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah. It almost feels fitting that it's almost like a bureaucratic nightmare for an Adventure League involving Act Inc. as well. Yeah, so I guess as well. So my immediate question is, I'm a huge Acquisitions Incorporated fan, mm-hmm. And because this kind of ties into adventure writing as a whole,
right? Yes.
What was it like? So I'll split my question into 2 parts. But okay. The first part is what was it like writing, for something of Act Inc. in that style?
So for me, it was a great experience being able to write in that style because one of the things that I like to do is balance some of the adventures that are a little more serious with some that are a little more whimsical.
Yeah.
And so having a chance to write that where one of the quests, and there were a combination of different quests that different tables had to choose from as they're all trying to do the most to make Acquisitions Incorporated look good in order to, it's franchise focus, and whoever ends up getting the most points at that event at PAX Unplugged ended up uh, being one of the future success stories where their group would get the franchise for this particular small town that we created. And so, just as an example, what one of those small mini adventures is the party gets hired to give a motivational speech to a rival organization, and the party shows up, and the kind of leader of this organization is a gnome with a completely dyed lime green beard. And all of the employees of Lucidity Industries, they all are wearing identical clothes. They're all completely uniform. And so what the party has to do is try and give a speech to kind of demotivate them, but subtly work in some things that Acquisitions Incorporated is a lot better. And so there was a lot of that tone.
Yeah. So I imagine like it definitely opens up a lot of like interesting adventure hooks or things that you just can't necessarily play with otherwise.
It does. Yeah. We had a lot of fun adventure hooks that all of the authors worked with, and not just adventure hooks, but also for a lot of us, it was kind of a breath of fresh air to write things that weren't as combat focused as sometimes other organized play adventures can be.
So I guess as well. So my part two of my question was originally then is the fact that this was a multi-table event. To use the terminology correctly. What were some of the challenges for like writing or like organizing an adventure in that style, because it's not common.
Yeah. So some of the challenges there is, and the biggest one is, if you go around and you survey people who do a lot of organized play and who play in a lot of these events or DM a lot of them, and I, in the lead up to writing this, I was DMing, on average about one of these a month, if not more, which is pretty high. But okay, so you go around, you survey people, everyone's going to have different things that they really want out of these one events. Mm-hmm. You can't satisfy everybody. So what Garrett Cologne and I did, and Garrett was the story lead for all the adventures in this for this event for PAX Unplugged, and was absolutely wonderful to work with. Has been, really great mentor to me. And we pretty much agreed that there were certain goals that we wanted to set, that we wanted to have something where players would be able to choose how much they wanted to do combat as opposed to exploration or social interaction. We decided that we wanted to have something that would be fun, that would be whimsical, that would be fitting a lot with the tone of Acquisitions Incorporated. Mm-hmm. And if someone was hoping that a multi-table interactive would be, well, it's a battle of life and death, and you're just fighting all the time, mm-hmm. there are other adventures that Adventures League has put out there that would be more to that player style.
Okay, interesting. And so again, just I guess for my own question then is like, so when you say like multi-table event, how many tables is that roughly?
All right, so this ended up being 23.
Wow. And
so yeah, and so what some of the other things that I had to do as well, this was not just a multi-table event, but one where there was a slight degree of competition because that would be kind of fitting with Acquisitions Incorporated, where you have all these different groups of, well, they're not interns, they're sub or sub interns, and they're all competing against each other trying to get that franchise. So, among other things, I had to come up with ways where, okay, you completed a little adventure. Here's some way that you can go around and mess with one of the other tables, because that could be a way for there to be some kind of interaction between these tables, because we also needed to come up with a story where all the tables, all these 24 different tables,
Mm-hmm.
would be feeling like they're a part of the same event and the same big adventure.
So as well, so you said that essentially it was kind of like a race to see how many sort of like things that they can do. Is it the case of like, so when it comes to actually sitting down and writing, and I take it you're not writing 23 adventures necessarily, or is it?
No, no. So the way that we structured this one is that there would be, in the beginning, all the parties were given an advance to help fix up this dilapidated wizard shack. And of course, this being Acquisitions Incorporated, it is an advance, not just you're given gold. And so that then parties would be able to do some quick things to say, oh, yeah, what kind of businesses do we want to go into? Well, some may want to go build a bar, some other service location. Some may want to start building weapons. Others may want to be certain kinds of information brokers,
Yeah.
or other maybe a little nefarious types. And so there were some quick options for all of them, which were designed in a lot of ways just to give people a chance to roll some dice early on instead of having to listen to a briefing or a DM for a long time. That's something in general I like to do in adventures, is try and avoid the 15-20 minutes of here is the DM explaining everything.
Yeah.
And then the middle section ended up being 7 subquests, with the idea that groups would try and do 3. And one of the other things that Garrett and I had to do is, because, kind of like you said, there can be a tendency among players to just race, and you don't necessarily get the best quality of experience if you're trying to race and complete as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to create a system and create encounters where there were tangible rewards for going a little slower and putting some more creative thought into how you want to do things instead of just racing forward.
No, that's
yep.
Yeah, no, it's like, yeah, it's kind of the sort of it's a design challenge that is like you can try and wrap your head around. But I take it like from running other sort of multi-table ventures or epics, you kind of pick up what the flow is and what it should be. And I take it the event went down it's really well.
Yeah, it went down very well. We got really positive feedback from it, and and hopefully we'll have a chance to run it again or something like that at future PAX events. That's something where it's an open discussion.
Yeah,
that's really all I can say about that at this point.
Because
kind of a discussion by people who are kind of above me on the food chain.
you just have to sort of weigh it out. I was like, so thank you for indulging me in that multi-table hacking talk. It's fascinating just because it's not too common. I'm curious. So when did you actually like start writing adventures and stuff like that? When did you actually get into everything? Did you start with hacking or?
No, so I started writing my first writing sample to try and get people to look at it and give me a chance to write a full-length uh, Adventurers League community-created content adventure
Mm-hmm.
around 2 years ago.
Okay.
But one of the things with the ALCCC program is kind of by design, it's a very long process from starting out, creating an adventure idea to actually having something released. So in my case, even though it's something where I've been working at writing adventures for a while, my first solo adventure only reached the DMs Guild, I think, 2 weeks before PAX Unplugged.
And yeah, so I imagine like it's a case of like you probably have like a number of adventures that are sort of kind of waiting to go through the
Yeah.
system before they can sort of be published. And yeah, what is so the first one, if I remember correctly, is it the toxicity?
So it's weird because Toxicity is the one that I started working on first, and
Oh.
as I was working on Toxicity, David Morris approached me to start writing Jaunt to the Center of Faerun
Mm-hmm.
because he had a deadline, and one of the things that can happen if there's such a long lead time is, well, things can happen with the writer who was initially scheduled to write a CCC project because life can happen and lots of things can happen to us.
Mm-hmm.
In a 6-month span, let alone a 9-month span or a year. So basically, David was looking for a new writer and had heard through a mutual friend of ours that, among other things, I have a journalism background. I can write things relatively quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so he contacted me to go ahead and write that one on for Adventurers League, what's a relatively short deadline.
And okay, interesting. And so when it comes to like writing for because right, obviously as you mentioned, was it just before this you had was it Exit Pursued by Owlbears and your like both collaboration projects with the Princess Project as well.
Yes.
In your mind, what do you find the differences between writing, like aside from like the fundamentals, like guidelines that you have in CCC and I guess guild content, but how do you find like the creative process? How does that differ?
So I think one of the things for the creative process is whether it's a CCC or whether it's an anthology, I'm going to be working with someone who has an idea of what it is that they're looking for as a project lead. And the main difference is with CCC, sometimes the project lead has not only an idea they're looking for, but there's a story arc in place.
Mm-hmm.
And they're looking for writers to help write adventures that fit into a broad overall storyline or broad overall story arc. And so they're making sure to have good communication back and forth with not only the person who's coordinating the story arc, but also the other writers who are involved is something that's very important. So in a lot of ways, when it works well, it's in some ways more collaborative, because with the anthologies, every adventure in an anthology is fitting a common theme, but writers can pretty much go and do their writing by themselves because the adventures don't directly tie into the same world. They don't have any characters who overlap.
So I guess
so
it's to latch onto that as like a adult question is how do you find like the process of continue like with CCC and actually the continuation of the continuation of someone else's story, and do you have any sort of like tips or like advice for like how you keep things consistent, or is that the job of like the editor?
That's something where as I've been working at it more, and as I've been working more closely with a range of not only other writers on projects, but also various story leads.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, some of the advice that I would have is just from my experience as a writer, when I got okay, here's what the story lead is interested in, and here's kind of the broad framework. Good story leads understand that, it's a good, I can give a framework, but I also want to give space to the writer to add things so the writer can also feel investment and ownership in the story.
Yeah.
So there's good collaboration back and forth. There's a good give and take. And going to bring up Garrett again, who was the story lead for the Acquisitions Incorporated adventures, and he came up with the broad idea of where all the adventures would be taking place in this kind of adventuring boomtown. Very much inspired by Deadwood.
Okay.
And then we had a writers' meeting where writers pitched various ideas. Adam Scaramella pitched the idea of having this very dour gnome who would be the Acquisitions Incorporated liaison and basically the closest we had to a traditional quest giver who would be a recurring character in every adventure. And then Adam and I worked together a little bit as, in terms of how to best present this character as a non-binary character. And so we had a lot of good collaborations there. And as it got closer and closer, we also had collaborations on, okay, do we have a bar in town? Okay, it's a boom town. Do we have 2 bars in town? Do we have enough bars in town for all the various things that we need?
Yeah.
Do we have maps? What other locations do we have? And so you get, with the best collaborations, you get a good back and forth. And as a writer, you embrace that there's going to be some of that give and take. The places where this runs into problems is sometimes there are writers who are focused entirely on their own ideas, and they don't necessarily communicate that well with others, or they aren't necessarily cognizant of how some of the things that they could do in the first adventure may affect other adventures later on in a trilogy.
Yeah. And then from there, it has like a knock-on effect. So yeah, you kind of have to be careful where you tread.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, no, that kind of perfect. It kind of leads me into like my next question, which is more of like, okay, well, in this whole part of the process, do you have like do you have like a favorite part?
So with me, the favorite parts vary a bit from adventure to adventure. It's usually at some point in the writing process, finding either some character or characterization that works really well to kind of illustrate what the entire story is about, or sometimes it's something more mechanical that's memorable, because one of the things that I really try and do is come up with something that's going to happen during the adventure that people are going to remember when they're done with the adventure.
Yeah.
And so one of my favorite things from the adventure that I wrote for the Princess Project is just a smaller scene trying to illustrate that, okay, the party has, not just the party, but the entire kingdom that they're in has just been pulled into hell. Well, how do I show the party that, okay, they're in hell all of a sudden?
Yeah.
That they're in this particular very lavish construct within hell? Well, all the roads are paved with gold. And not only are all the roads paved with gold, and there are some people who are dressed in very fine gowns and suits. They're walking to the big wedding. And then there's a dwarf who just came out of her shift working at a bar, clearly looks like she's just come out of her shift, and can't step on the road because the road is strictly enforcing the hierarchy of hell and charging a toll.
Yeah.
And so if characters want to try and help her out, they can try, but they have to pass this being a level 20 adventure. If they want to help her out, they have to be able to succeed a DC 23 charisma saving throw. The idea being, just trying to show the players that the kind of laws of hell are so strong that it takes considerable force of will to even have a chance of overcoming them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. That kind of leads into like the last question as well, because I was chatting with Ginny not too long ago about writing high tier adventures, and obviously we were talking about how like writing a tier 1 adventure compared to like a tier 4, they're different beasts entirely. And the amount of like assumptions you're allowed to make with a tier 1, saying, okay, well, chances are a D6 to a level 1 character is gonna hurt, but with a level 20, I don't know how you how did you find writing an adventure of that standard? Not standard, but yeah, you know what I mean.
So, yeah, I know what you mean. So, one of the things that I find, and I think this is in some ways counterintuitive, is because as a designer, you have to make fewer assumptions about what characters can do because depending on your group, level 20 could mean a lot of different things because different groups are going to have different levels of, some may call it optimization, some may call it power gaming, playing with the group where some members of the group self-identify as, quote, dirty power gamers as kind of badge of pride. It's something that's, I think, relatively unique to Los Angeles, where there are a number of people in the LA gaming area, particularly people who've been attached to organized play in Los Angeles, who are both very invested in role-playing and also very good at optimizing characters.
The two worlds collide.
Yeah, in Los Angeles, the two worlds collide on a regular basis. So I have a lot of experience seeing what it is that relatively optimized high-level characters can do. And at a certain point, there's only so much you can do as a writer to fully address the difference in power there's going to be between some high-tier groups and others. And so, to a certain degree, you can make recommendations to the DM about, here's how you may have to adjust. I'd say for the level 20 adventure that I wrote for the Princess Project, I gave 3 different scaling options. One of them was written roughly with the guidelines in the Dungeons Masters Guide. Mm-hmm. The other, I'm like, probably about 4 times the expected experience difficulty of encounters that's in the Dungeon Masters Guide. And I know that in some of the games that I play with, we don't really use the Dungeon Masters Guide, but if you put some of the encounters into the formula, it'd be like, oh yeah, 5 times, 6 times.
Yeah, some people just they can just take those encounters and just shrug it off, and they'll be like, oh, was that supposed to be hard? Or
I mean, the game I play in on Thursdays after our group had to shake off a couple things. Like, okay, now we know where the Garistro and the Wizard controlling are coming from. Let's see what we can do. Okay, we're prepared. The first 2 characters go. We've done enough damage to kill the Garistro twice. Yes, the first 2 characters, not just the.
Yeah. Like, you got to feel sorry for some of the low dex characters who, like, every encounter, they're just like, I blink and they've killed everyone. Literally, in the matter of 6 seconds, they've.
Oh yeah, and that's something that I had to do as a DM the last time I was DMing Tier 4 is you kind of retcon something behind the scenes of oh yeah, the Lich, the Lich cast invulnerability, because that was the only way that the Lich was going to survive past the Paladin, who was first in initiative.
Yeah.
Would have just killed the Lich boss, and so when writing high tier adventures, there's some of those adjustments that if you've been DMing high tier for long enough, you know to do. But if you're newer to DMing those adventures, you have to be taught. And if you're newer to writing adventures, there are certain things that you might be used to in terms of how to kind of herd players in particular directions that don't work in high tier play.
Yeah, no, I think, like, speaking from my own experiences, so a lot of the DMing I've done is we tend to like run like low tier campaigns. So like we get to like around like level 10 to 15, and then we move on to the next.
Yeah.
So it is a case of like I don't think I'll ever be ready. I think the first time I sit down and everybody sits down with their level 20 characters, I think I will be mortified and learn a lot as a DM in the best of ways. But definitely like learn things. I almost forgot. I forgot to ask the counterpoint to one of my earlier questions, which is like, so when it comes to like the creative process of writing an adventure or for everything, do you have like a least favorite part? Or
so, I think my least favorite part would be some of the times when I'm waiting. When I've done my part and then I'm just kind of waiting for the release, because I don't deal with necessarily waiting or anxiety that well. It's something else that I've realized is that I find it's a lot better for me when I'm working on something and I'm waiting for someone else later on, that if they give me more of a specific time of when it is that they would be ready for me. When people say, oh, I'll get to it, or I'll get to it as soon as I can, or I know it's in the process, that's kind of anxiety producing for me. If someone says, look, I can't get to this for 2 weeks, then I know in my head, okay, this isn't something that's going to happen for 2 weeks. I can take it out of my head and focus on other things.
Yeah. And I imagine the long tail end on CC titles being published onto the DMsGuild probably isn't the most helpful in that sense.
And they do everything they can, but it's not just that. It's also sometimes when it comes to editing, for example, or if there's a question that I may have for a story lead, then it's a lot easier if they're just firm deadlines and I have a sense of when people either are or are not available. And in some ways, I think one of the best things that everyone out there can do is be up front and say, look, here are particular times when I'm not available, because that lets everybody else on the team be able to put that in their own calendars and adjust.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a fundamental of like solid teamwork, and especially in working in these team-based environments, it's kind of imperative, or kind of helps. The greases the wheel. I don't know if that's right. I've said it now. That greases the wheel. So, okay, cool. No, interesting. So, moving on from that a little bit, then. So, when you first started to the kind of like where you are now, then, are there any sort of particular lessons you wish you'd learned earlier?
Yeah, I think there are 2 lessons that are going to go in that are completely unrelated and are going to go in completely different directions.
Oh, by means, I'm here for a journey.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I learned is sometimes in adventures there can be a tendency to present someone getting some kind of madness or going insane or otherwise having some kind of mental health issue as the main explanation for why it is that they do villainous behavior.
Mhm.
Or there are also things where sometimes stories will present, oh, here was a character who experienced trauma, and as a result of their trauma, they focused on getting revenge. And that's the entire uh, character development. And that's something that can be very stigmatizing to people who have either experienced various kinds of trauma or who day to day live with various kinds of mental health issues.
Mhm.
And so that's something where it's been something that I focused much more on uh, as as I've been writing more. It's something I focused more on because it's something that had to be pointed out to me. So I wanted to bring that lesson forward.
Yeah. And no, in fairness, that is a good lesson. Like the same thing of like as you're writing, you have like inherent, unconscious biases.
Yeah,
And
and
also,
so one of my one of my first antagonists is like, maybe I presented them in a sympathetic way, maybe not so much. I'm not 100% sure.
mhm. and I suppose the one of the things about putting a restriction on saying, okay, well, let's not say it's a villain is based like the way they are because of like madness or trauma. That's something of a cliche, and by not leaning or going back on
Yeah,
like problematic things, you come up with something more creative, something more unique, and maybe
yeah,
something that people can relate to a little bit more.
yeah. And along with that, I think that one of the other things that I'm surprised by, particularly as a DM, is how rare it seems that the villains, particularly if you're writing a villain who you clearly intend as a villain, to try and get under the player's skin, so the players really just want to stop this villain.
Yeah.
Let the villain enjoy being villainous. Let them have fun.
Yeah. Not
Let the
not
DM have a little bit of that fun, and that will get the players engaged.
Yeah. Not every villain needs to be redeemed. Some people are just bad and they just
No,
need to be dealt with.
no, yeah,
So you
yeah,
mentioned
and if they're not going, so yeah, so some definitely can be redeemed, and others, yeah, let them enjoy being villains.
yeah.
But yeah, the other thing that I learned, this is also a very personal thing that I kind of had to learn the hard way, is when I was first trying to feel my way through the DMs Guild, and I didn't really know many people, didn't really know many creators. Some of the first people who I reached out to were pretty hostile to me coming out as being both bisexual and non-binary. And so that made me very, very hesitant to reach out to anybody else because I wasn't sure who I could trust and who I could be myself around. And so one of the things that because I had this really traumatic experience as I was coming out, and traumatic experience with trying to come out through some of the people or around some of the people in my local D&D community who thankfully are at this point are not as major parts of the local D&D community. It took me a long time to feel comfortable reaching out to people, and that means it took a long time for me to realize that most of the creators who I've met who were members and who were, kind of actively participating in the DMs Guild community have either been some of my biggest supporters as I've been coming out and as I've come out, or at the very least have been tolerant. And that's really kind of all I'd ask from people. But because I did have this pretty traumatic experience, which I've talked some about, it made it very hard for me to reach out to people at first.
And no, so first and foremost, I'm super sorry that sort of thing, you had to go through that sort of thing.
Yeah, thanks.
And I think one thing I guess I like about having this opportunity on the podcast is we do have, like I said, the thankfully the DMs Guild community has a lot of good eggs, and it does feel. I mean, like, so I think we were chatting just before the podcast how the Play It Forward thing. There's a real buzz in the community at the moment.
There is, there absolutely is.
And I'm glad you had the opportunity to put the I guess I'm not sure how to put it, but find a positive experience in everything.
Yes,
is probably the best way to put it. And I guess to keep a sort of positive spin on things, when you sort of began sort of reaching out and sort of having that sort of getting sort of positive feedback or acceptance and stuff like that, how did that sort of like help with your writing, or did it at all, or like
yeah, it's one of those things where it's almost a little hard to describe what came first. How much was it that the reaching out to people came first? How much was the writing that came first? Because they went back and forth.
Yeah.
And for me, finding some community through a number of the other creators on the Friends, Foes, and Other Fine Folks anthology of diverse NPCs that you can add to your game was something that was a really wonderful community for me to connect to.
Yeah. No, awesome. And then I guess that I'm gonna reshuffle the order of my questions slightly because it kind of touches nicely. When you started sort of like getting in contact with people and stuff like that, were there anyone in particular who really helped support you and sort of like brought you up, or
Yeah, so in a couple of different ways, with organized play, there are a number of people who helped me out and really brought me up. Jay Africa was, who's local to me in Los Angeles. I was able to start asking him about it after, being a player at his table at a Los Angeles convention, and that's one of the ways that I got started. And and he, that definitely helped me out early on when he was much more active in the writing community. And both Anthony Joyce and Garrett Cologne. Garrett's definitely been a real mentor to me. In particular, not just as we were working on the Acquisitions Incorporated work, but also as someone who's written a lot of high tier play and has a very good idea of how it is to challenge different kinds of high tier players.
Mm-hmm.
And then outside of the DMs Guild, Lynn Meyer was one of the first writers who I really started talking to a lot about coming out and trying to put that to a certain degree in my games and in adventures that I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
And and since then, also really getting to know and talk a lot more with Jess Markram and Kat Evans.
Yeah,
they've all been really supportive of me in various ways.
No, yeah, no. Again, it's always nice when you hear names and you're like, yeah, no, I've heard of that person. It's about, or I've spoken to that person as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's and so I guess I guess I have like a more of like I guess like a slightly, I guess it could be phrased as like a slightly personal question that you said when you were speaking about coming out and trying to like I guess put yourself or infuse that into your adventures. How would you like? So I'm going to preface this by just saying I'm a cis white dude, but for people who are listening and stuff like that who may want to begin to sort of attempt this process, what do you have any advice for them or?
So I think the main thing that I would say is something which I have tweeted about a bit before is part of my experience was kind of questioning both my gender and my sexuality and being able to, and for some people, being able to play characters who aren't identified the same way as we may publicly identify.
Mm-hmm.
Is a really important process. And for me, that was a part of my process. But also for me, being able to start writing, in particular, writing some non-binary characters is when I started realizing more and more that, this feels right. This feels like the right way to describe myself as well. And that's just something where it took a bit of trial and error and happenstance, and and in terms of sexuality, that's something where it's more trial and error and happenstance as a player, just because as a player, when I'm role playing, I'm a pretty kind of method actor, and realizing that I guess the character would be attracted, is attracted to someone of the same gender. Yeah, this feels right. And then the afterwards going, well, wait, what does this mean? That was weird. And there's all that messy stuff that goes along with it. But for the most, and it's dealing with some of those messy feelings. Some of the best advice that I got is, hey, look, all this stuff is complicated. You don't have to have all the answers right away. Because as much as I go out there and talk openly as a non-binary writer, I don't have it all figured out.
I suppose. I certainly wasn't asking for like a one-stop solution for everything.
No, and it's a process.
No, I honestly thank you so much for answering that like so openly and just breaking that down, because I think it's it's as you said, it's being open about it and just saying that you don't have all the answers. It's helpful for people who maybe in a similar situation to you.
And there's one other thing that I wanted to add to that, and I think that partially because there were some traumatic experiences that I went through as a part of my coming out process, and partially just because in general, cis, trans, gay, straight, a lot of D&D characters come from not necessarily the best family backgrounds, or you don't see a whole lot of positive family role models.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I've increasingly tried to do in my adventures is write in uh, positive families and couples who are experiencing positive emotions, who are happy together, to try and make sure that that is a part of our gaming world, because I think that's something that's very healthy to incorporate.
I think as well, it kind of leans to like a lot of us as writers like subverting tropes, and the idea of like just a normal happy family is almost subverting a trope in itself because like all adventurers are coming from like being orphans or coming from thing, and the idea of just like, oh no, I had a very happy family, I'm just adventuring for the fun of it, those they're less common, and just
Yeah,
to sort of like bringing them back into the adventures, it's a little bit.
yeah,
Yeah, perfect. Okay, cool. So
oh yeah, and that's part of it too.
yeah, I was going to say, so the last sort of questions I have towards the end are kind of like looking to the future. Um, and so are you working on anything at the moment that you can talk about?
So let's see that I can talk about. Uh, a lot of the things that I'm working on right now, unfortunately, are things that I can't talk about for one reason or another. I think we talked a little before hitting the record button about when this would be going live, and so I
Yeah.
think that by the time this goes live, some of the things that I've started working on are going to be a little more public knowledge, and
Hmm.
some of them aren't. But in a lot of ways, I'm in a bit of a transition period, starting to pick up a couple of projects here and there, but I'm also doing a lot in terms of uh, managing an online convention right now,
Hmm.
because one of the things that's been a big change for me since the pandemic, and I'm not sure what it's like where you are, but where I am in Los Angeles, we've been under uh, very strong recommendations to shelter in place
Yeah.
for. I think that when this podcast gets put online, it'll be about 2 months,
Hmm.
and so one of the things for me is someone who has experience helping uh, organize online events is, since various events started canceling and various places started getting put on stay in place orders or lockdowns, I've been doing a lot more work helping various groups move their games online
Hmm.
and wearing a lot more of the uh, convention administrator hat and less of the DM's Guild creator hat.
So actually, funnily enough, I meaning to mention this before we start. So I think it was about 3 days after we had this like today's meeting booked. I was catching up on some of the Dragon Talk episodes that I missed. And that's when I realized you were on recently. You were on Dragon Talk to talk about
Yes,
moving games online, and it was
yes,
that weird
yes.
situation of like, oh,
Yeah, basically, as soon as you start having a number of conventions start canceling, Wizards of the Coast reached out to me relatively quickly. Starting with a comment with pretty early on, writing something for written for the D&D Adventures League website, but it applies to anyone, whether or not they're running Adventures League games or not, about just some of the very basics of what it is that you'd need to run a game online. And one of the first things I talk about isn't what kind of program do you use or anything like that. It's a question of how important is it for you to have that visual face to face like we're having now.
no, no, it was a really good chat, and
Thanks.
this is more of like a personal question, and I mean personal for me in the sense of like, what
All
was
right.
it like being on Dragon Talk? What was that like?
Oh, it was great. Unfortunately, there were a couple of technical difficulties in terms of setting up the chat.
Yeah.
I think largely on my end. So we didn't get to talk for quite as long as I would have hoped for because, I like to talk a lot, obviously. But it
Well,
was a wonderful experience, and I'm glad that it was helpful for people.
no, as I say, you talk the perfect amount for a guest. I think that's that's what you want. You want people to come on and like I said, the people
Excellent.
are here to hear you chat. And no, this has been a sort of super insightful chat. I guess so. I guess I'll keep it moving and ask the sort of like second to last question then. Do you have any sort of particular dream projects?
So there's one project which has been on the shelf for a long time. It was a project where it was originally for an online convention that got canceled, and the premise was that there are these two characters, one who uh, is in the Feywild,
Mhm.
and the other who's in the Prime Material Plane, and they've never met before, but they talk back and forth because they each have opposite ends of a sending stone.
Okay.
And sending can communicate between planes. And so the basic premise for the adventure is that they try to get together in the Feywild to meet for the first time.
Oh,
And
that sounds like such a heartwarming, lovely adventure. It makes me think immediately
and
of do you know the game Firewatch?
I'm aware of it, yeah.
Yeah, it
I haven't
makes
played
me
it, but I'm aware of it.
that the whole game is literally about two people chatting with walkie-talkies, which sending stones are. But what you were saying?
Yes, and of course, as they're planning it, there are various villainous machinations along the way.
Mhm.
But this was an adventure that was initially proposed for uh, an Adventures League (CCC) for a convention that ultimately had to get canceled, and so this adventure has been kind of on the back burner since. As I think a lot of creators have that one project that eventually we'll get around to,
Yeah.
and that's the project that's my eventually I'll get around to it.
No, that's that. No, I can't wait for it. I'm already excited about the idea. No, no, yeah, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm stumbling over my words there, just because, like, yeah, I'm just my mind is going through, like, I like the Feywild, and yeah, taking the like I guess almost like the little known effects of like a magical item, like the fact that sending stones go between planes and playing with that. Like, I'm sure there's so many little things you could do in with the magic items in the DM's Guild alone, and have these sort of fun little adventures with. Um, but honestly, Noah, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with me. Um, if people are curious, and basically because of this time when this episode comes out, you will have some things announced. So people should run over and try and find out these things about you. Where can they go?
Yeah. So the easiest way to find me is on Twitter at Noah Grand.
Nice and simple.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, and that will be the best place to get all the sort of notifications on your future things.
Oh yeah. That's the best place to find me. In particular, I think that the thing that expecting to be announced more of a any day now as we're recording on the 4th, so it should be done if this podcast is released, say, a week later. Is something that will be in my Twitter bio, so it'll be very easy to find.
Yeah, I was going to say the funny thing is by saying that I'm actually recording ahead of the time, you're peeling back the veil that like I'm a decent podcast host and I have things organized and I have a backlog, because I think there's been a few weeks where I have been sort of like running by like the thread of my pants with like trying to get a guest a few days before. But
Hey, that's something that I do too as a convention organizer sometimes. Yeah. Some things are more organized than others.
yeah, so no, dude, I'm glad kindred spirits in that sense. Also, so technically, I did lie. I do have one last question. How do you end a podcast?
How do I end the podcast?
Yeah. How would you end a podcast? I do it every week. I'm struggling for ideas. I've tried everything, and
I think you have to end it with an existential question.
wow,
Something like, how do you end the podcast?
well, I'll give that a go. So I have been Matthew Whitby. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Again, be sure to follow Noah on his Twitter and stuff like that. His handle will be around, and a link to all his DMsGuild products will be in the description below. How do you end a podcast?
That's a great question, Matthew. It's been so great having the chance to talk with you. But remember, audience members, we've got a question for you. We've got homework. How do you end a podcast?